Okay, everyone, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're from. We're glad that you're here with us today. Welcome to another fine seminar. My name is Lauren Hayes. I'll be your host. I'm a professor at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga in Chattanooga, Tennessee in the United States. And I have a couple of just quick announcements before we introduce our speaker today. First off, I want to thank last week's speaker, Annalise Beery, who gave a really fascinating talk on behavior in voles. And I want to remind people about next week. We have a special kind of find next week where we're having a panel of people who do long-term studies will be joining us to answer questions posted by some of the students that work in the find. Panelists will be talking about their experiences in long-term field studies. And we really encourage people to send their students to this because we're going to have over 100 years of experience in the field, those people joining us. So we hope that you'll send your people to this, to your students in particular. And just a quick note, my understanding is that Europe changes its clocks soon. The United States is going to be behind schedule on that. So the time difference will be different, or there'll be a difference in time. We will be hosting the Find seminar at the usual US time, 11 a.m. New York. So for those of you in Europe, please just note that time will be off by an hour, and just pay close attention to the hours that are in the announcement we send, please. The week after that, we have Julia Fisher, who will be talking about social behavior, social evolution in baboons. So some really cool stuff coming up. So those of you who are new to Find, the seminar will be about 45, 50 minutes or around that, followed by up to an hour of discussion. And we ask that during this time you keep your microphones on mute. And during the discussion, just post your question marks in the chat and I'll relay those to Andy. And so this brings me to today's speaker. We're really thrilled to have Dr. Andy C. join us today. Just a brief intro bio about Andy. He's a distinguished professor in environmental science and policy at UC Davis in California. And I think one of the reasons we want to invite Andy is because his research encompasses a wide, broad spectrum of behavioral ecology. He's interested in the evolutionary ecological impacts of behavior, focusing on predator-prey interactions and social and mating behavior. And mostly working with aquatic organisms, Andy's research has focused and basically been a pioneer in the area of behavioral syndromes, personality theory, but he's also done a lot in building theory on social networks and behaviors associated with ecological invasion. So quite a diverse area of understanding behavior. Not surprisingly, Andy's work has been well funded. I found his website several sources, Ford Foundation, National Science Foundation in the United States, and the environmental or EPA supports his work. Andy's work has been well published. He has well over 300 publications to his record. And remarkably, he's been cited over 40,000 times, according to Google Scholar, with an I-10 index over 200. And he's regarded as an ISI highly cited researcher. And this morning, I just did a quick check again, and I found that there were 7 papers that have been cited over 1,000 times. So his work has been really well received and acknowledged by his peers. He's also won a number of awards, such as a Fellow of the Animal Behavior Society, the Quest Award from the Animal Behavior Society, and an Exemplar Award from the same organization. And today, Andy's going to be presenting to us, and the title of his talk is Individual Differences in Behavior and Social Dynamics that Influence Ecologically Important Outcomes, 3 case studies. And with that, thank you, Andy, for being here, and looking forward to your talk.
Okay, great. Everybody can hear me fine, I guess? Right, okay. So first, I'd of course like to thank Lauren, Eduardo, Karsten for organizing this overall phenomenon and for inviting me to participate. So there is my title, and what I'll be basically giving you is almost a smear of some of the work that's been going on in my lab over the last decade or so. with all on some aspect of these individual differences in behavior or animal personalities, but with at least some emphasis on social aspects. And so when I give, oops, didn't advance there. Okay, when I give this talk on animal personalities to a broader audience, I always start with quite some time on just explaining what are animal personalities. And here I imagine I can go through it a little faster, but I always say that, of course, we're accustomed to people having different personalities, having different ways in which they behave relatively consistently, and that we're accustomed to that with dogs, and personalities, and individual cats. And that over the last probably about 20 years now, we've accumulated a lot of evidence that lots of species show these consistent individual differences in behavior. That how we normally sort of measure it is repeatedly assay individuals, usually in some sort of standardized assay, and find that although individuals exhibit behavioral plasticity, where what they do, of course, depends on the exact context, they also exhibit consistent behavioral types or personalities, where some are more bold, others more shy, others, somewhere in the middle in the spectrum, some more aggressive, others less so, and so on. And that basically individuals exhibit some level of within individual behavioral consistency, as opposed to being like all over the place, and that there tend to be consistent differences between individuals in their behavior. And we've built, I think, a reasonable integrative overview that both genetics, including specific candidate genes and heritability, and environmental experiences shape a combination of physiology, morphology, things about the brain that interact with the behavioral type, the personality, that behavioral type and the environment affect fitness, thus affecting big ecological and evolutionary impacts. And that, interestingly enough, behavioral type often affects behavioral type dependent situation choice and what environments the organisms are found in. So I think we've built a basic overview of how personality fits into the big picture. Just to quickly clarify some things that still seem like they might need clarification is that animals, of course, are both plastic and have consistent personalities. So the existence of plasticity doesn't mean that individuals don't have personalities. You probably have both plasticity and personality. These do not have to be stable over a lifetime. We still sometimes hear that, no, my animals, are not stable over a lifetime. In fact, again, your personality quite likely is not stable over your whole lifetime. They just need to be stable over, an ecologically relevant time period. They are heritable, but they're also affected by experiences. And although early on we sort of emphasized that sometimes they're associated pretty clearly with suboptimal behavior, where the very bold are sometimes too bold, and the more shy are sometimes too shy, and so on. It's not part of the definition of the phenomena. Okay, so that's a quick overview. So what I'll be talking about is how personalities interact with social dynamics, or social behavior at least, in ways that affect these phenomena. And I'll launch into it. So the first one we'll get into is sexual selection. So this is the issue of what determines variation in mating success. I'll take the usual sort of standard kind of thing that we're focusing in on the males and their variation in mating success, where there's certainly huge amounts of information that bigger, stronger males tend to mate more, and that often, perhaps more interestingly, males with spectacular ornaments of some sort tend to mate more than others. And in yet other cases, we find that males with beautiful songs tend to have good mating success. But an interesting fact that came up in meta-analyses of other meta-analyses, for that matter, is that that although we think these are really important, it turns out that they tend to explain a fairly small percentage of the variation in mating success. A meta-analysis finding that the norm is about 5%, 4 to 9%. So a lot of the variation in mating success does not seem to be due to these traits that we think of as being super important. And so what I'll be suggesting is that How about behavior differences? How about personality as part of what explains variation in mating success? What about personality? And here I just have this silly picture. This is my son. We're at a Yankee baseball game. And, this is sort of embarrassing for him. And I've told him I do this, but he's a guy that people like, and including women do seem to like him. And it's not, as far as I can tell, he's certainly not particularly big and strong. He's not wealthy for that matter. He doesn't have ornaments that I know of. But he's a really nice guy, and people just really like him a lot. And I believe his personality has a lot to do with what success he has in life. And so the question is, might that be true in other species? Let's study it. And so we've been studying it for the last quite a few years in water striders, Aquarius remiges. They are these bugs that skate over the surface of the water, commonly found in these natural streams like I show here, as well as in my artificial streams. And a cool thing about them is they mate a lot. So during a mating season of even a couple of months, they're typically mating with new partners every day, maybe every other day, and just spending a lot of time mating and generating huge amounts of data on relative mating success. And the way it works is males are highly active on the water surface, skating around and basically harassing females. So any female that comes out on the open water, males jump on them, no courtship, just try to forcibly mate. Females almost always strongly resist these mating attempts, almost certainly because females can store sperm for a few weeks at a time. They don't need to mate yet over and over and over again. And when they do mate, females typically end up carrying the male on their back for often the rest of the day, and females just don't seem to want to do that. So females spend a lot of their time actually hiding along the banks, but they do need to come out to feed, and typically end up pairing with a male simply to actually be able to live their life okay and actually go out there and get food. As I say, they typically mate every day for 2 to 10 hours per mating, thus spending roughly 50% of their adult life during the active mating season in the physical act of mating. Main point is generate tons of data on mating, easy to watch it all happen. And so over the last 30 years or so, we have done a whole series of experiments, including ones where we manipulate the group's mix of behavioral types, along with manipulations of various social ecological factors like the group size, the sex ratio, the background predation risk, food levels, habitat structure, and connectivity, the ability of animals to move from pool to pool as they wish. A typical experiment involves observing every individual from typically 50 to 100 times, over and over again, and seeing each time, what are they doing? What is their behavior right now, their activity, their aggressive levels, whether they're feeding or not, and of course, their mating success. So over the course of an experiment that lasts a couple of weeks, some individuals will mate 15 or even more times, others not at all. And what I have here is just a list of some of the papers over the years, and I haven't even updated this to the sort of the newest experiments or newest papers. So this is what we typically do. And what I'm going to show you is just some of our main results. And here, in fact, are just some of the main collaborators all out at our artificial streams. So Jason Waters, who was a postdoc with me, Tina Wei, Pierre-Olivier Montilio, and Chang, among others. Okay, so do male water striders have a personality? Do they show consistent behavioral differences? Like my son has a personality, and yes, they do. So here is just a typical repeatability level we get of 0.44, highly significantly different from random. And again, we see this over and over again. And this is the sort of level of repeatability typically seen in studies. In fact, it's about the repeatability that we would get out of a population of people like yourselves. Does mating success depend on the personality, on behavioral type? And absolutely, yes, it does. And this is just showing actually the first of a bunch of papers that repeatedly see this. So the number I've got here is the effect size of the effect of the behavioral type, the activity aggressiveness of individual males on their mating success. coming out of a mixed model with loads of other things in the model. And basically, the more active, aggressive males mate more because they're just out there trying to mate, and they also tend to spend more time in the places where most of the mating occurs. Does behavior and mating success also depend on the social environment they're in? And here, absolutely yes. And that one major way it depends on the social environment is it depends on the presence of these guys, these hyper-aggressive males that I'll abbreviate as hams. And hyper-aggressive males are water strider males who are just totally out of control. They are zipping around, frantically jumping on anything else that's on the water and trying to mate with it. So they obviously do this with females, but they also pretty obviously are furiously trying to mate with males that do not want to mate with them. And you end up with long somersaulting fights that go on for almost minutes at a time. They're trying to mate with large juveniles, with other species. And as I say, they've even been seen apparently trying to mate with the dead crickets that are floating there that are the food in the experiment. And so when hyper-aggressive males are present, which tends to be roughly 10% of the time a pool has a hyper-aggressive male, these guys can only do it for a few days at a time, and then they seem to either tire out or somehow they stop doing it, and then they might start again a few more days later. So when they're present in a pool, there's a big decrease in everyone else's activity. So this is just one of various experiments that show this. This is an experiment where we actually created groups of all animals that have been pre-assessed as relatively aggressive, medium aggressive, and low in aggressiveness. And the main thing to see here is the blue bars are the activity of everybody else when there's no hyper-aggressive male, and then the behavior of the individuals, the clear bar, when there is a hyper-aggressive male. And so the main thing to get is there's a big decrease in activity when the hyper-aggressive males are present. You'll note also that even in the low aggression treatment, some cases arose of a hyper-aggressive male flaring up. So this is social plasticity. This is behavior depends not just on the individual's behavioral type, but also on is there a hyper-aggressive male present. And when he's present, he actually messes up mating for everybody. So this is the same basic setup. The blue bar again is roughly 50, 40, 50, 60% of the time they're in the physical act of mating. But with the hyper-aggressive male present, much, much less mating. So this is technically, this is group selection against hyper-aggressiveness. They mess up the entire group. And we've had a series of papers on that. But do they also exhibit more nuanced social plasticity than just when there's this crazy guy in there? Of course, you have to hide from him. And they do exhibit more nuanced plasticity. So what we've got is we've got data on every one of, over the various experiments, hundreds and hundreds of individuals over and over again. And for every observation, we know who else is in the pool, how many males and females are in the pool, what is everyone else doing. So we can ask for each individual, do they show social plasticity that is consistent? Or some, what do they do as a function of how many other males are in the pool and how active are those other males? And males tend to be more active when the pool has more females in the pool. And this is simple enough. It's the mating season. But they also tend, on average, to be more active when there are more males in the pool. But I think more interestingly, they also show individual consistent differences in their social plasticity. They don't show consistent differences in their plasticity in response to females. They all tend to get more active when there are more females present, but they do consistently differ in how they respond to when there's more males in the pool. Some of them, most of them, get more active when there are more males in the pool with them. They seem to get just sort of, they gear each other up to zip around and jump on each other. But some of them don't seem to respond to the number of males in the pool, and some of them even get less active. And this is not, I think, biologically like unusual and non-intuitive. I'd say more what we've got is we've just had enough data to be able to actually quantify these consistent individual differences in their plasticity. But I think even more interestingly, we have the data to also show that greater social plasticity is in fact associated with higher mating success, even in one of these mixed models that looks at various other factors that affect mating success. And so what this is quantitative data assessing adaptive social plasticity in these bugs. So to just put it out there in big words, these are bugs, but they exhibit not only social plasticity, but consistent individual differences in that and in their personality, and that includes adaptive social plasticity. So if they can do it, I'm guessing many of your animals are also doing this. Now, back to the hyperaggressive males, they mess up life for others, but out of all that frantic attempt to mate with everything they see, do they at least enjoy high mating success by being so hyperaggressive? And what we found in one data set after another, one experiment after another, is no, they do not. And what's basically going on is they are so aggressive, they've driven everybody else basically out of the pool. But if anyone is in the pool, often they spend so much time actually struggling with non-females that a female might even go by and they don't even see it because they're busy struggling and attempting to mate with something else. So they have poor mating success from their hyperaggressiveness. And so this suggested to us this maybe not totally new buzz term of individual differences in social skill. And so what we're suggesting is maybe the obvious thing, that these hyperaggressive males that again only flare up here or there have low social skill. On the other hand, we do have evidence of high social skills. So I've shown you that just some of the data on how they exhibit adaptive social plasticity. We have other data showing that they also have individual differences, but adaptive social situation choice. That is, some of them seem to realize quickly, just using anthropomorphic terms, that I'm in a pool that has lots of males and not many females. There's not much mating going on. They seem to realize that quickly and get out of there and try another pool. Whereas others of them seem to stay in those same pools over and over, for days at a time, not quickly moving on. And so this difference in their social situation choice is consistent differences that does also quantitatively in these mixed models influence their overall mating success. So again, to summarize here, social skill plays a fairly important role in variation mating success in these male water striders at various levels. And so we have the simple suggestion, might this not be true in other animals? So it's sort of a challenge to sort of see what constitutes social skill in your system and to see if you can quantify the individual differences and how important is it in mating success. And so we had this paper with Gail Patricelli and David Sin emphasizing aspects of the variation in social skill and behavioral skill more generally. Okay, and I think in social ecology of behavioral types, there's lots more yet worthy of study about things about individual personalities and plasticity, the groups mix, how they influence social dynamics that influences both individual and group fitness. Okay, so that's sort of case study one, topic one. I'm now going to move on to things about ecological invasions and how they relate to behavior, including sort of social tendencies. So invasive species, obviously a big topic in the modern world. I have not personally studied these giant snakes, though the lab has actually studied these black widow spiders and crayfish. And when invasion ecologists talk about the overall process, they note that one could split into at least these three stages, where invasive species, pests, have to spread well. Often we put them into places, but often the real pests even spread from there. They have to be able to establish well, which is do well at low density, then grow to high density and have a high invader impact when they get to high density. And that there are quite a few studies, including some of our own, showing that relative aggressiveness, being an aggressive, bold type, can make them really good at having a big impact as pests. But for a dozen years or so, we've been emphasizing also the dispersal tendency aspect on spread an initial ability to establish. And we've been asking, is dispersal behavioral type dependent, and how might that play a role in the overall invasion? So this goes back to, even almost 20 years ago that Lauren Pinter was asking that question of her crayfish, where the basic simple idea is if you had a source population with bold and shy individuals, the BNS for bold and shy, that you wouldn't be surprised if in many systems there's active behavioral type dependent dispersal, where you might have the bold ones that tend to disperse. And if they go into areas without major predation risk, given that they're also active and aggressive, this might be what gives you pests. The bold and active ones dispersing and being pests. Of course, if they go into areas with heavy predation risk, they might have trouble there. They might need enemy release to succeed. But it's also possible that the social system has the shy or unaggressive ones that are driven out as the dispersers. And if that's what's going on, they might establish okay, but not be as likely to be pests. So this is the kind of thing that we've been interested in studying for the last dozen years or so. When we first suggested this, actually even got it into a New York Times Magazine article about animal personalities, a member of the public wrote and said, well, this is the American story. As, for example, summarized in this popular book, sort of popular science book, where the author said America has a sort of a psyche, a personality, that the author pictured that Americans tend to be rebels, tend to be people who are fortune seekers, who say, just get out of my way, don't order me around, don't have any rules on me, just let me do what I want to do, make money, and consume, and have like a big energy footprint for that matter, drive SUVs, and for that matter, literally eat too much and get obese, and that's America. And if you ask, why is America like that? The suggestion was, it's because that's the type of person who has colonized America over and over again over the many years. And that in many places, when things get tough, a lot of people just hunker down and make the best of it. But those rebellious fortune seekers who are, end up being the ones that disperse to America. And if that's what it is, that you shouldn't be surprised that America is the way it is. Or for that matter, maybe Australia is the way it is. Now, I always like to point out that America, of course, is more complex than that. So I really like this book that notes that America is really 11 different countries that are all mashed together, that is made up of 11 different, basic in each case, the culture of different parts of the country shaped by the particular colonists and why they went there and what their culture was. And that still explains why the Deep South is different from California and continues to be part of a major part of the American problem, I guess. But the issue still is, in some ways, personality-dependent dispersal. And so that's been studied a whole bunch in lots of species over the last dozen years. And we've been focusing on that with mosquitofish that are officially listed as one of the top 100 invasive pests in the world. And the initial set of work we did on this was with Julien Cote, who was a postdoc then and is a faculty member at University of Toulouse. And so what we found in a whole series of papers is that dispersal in the mosquitofish depends to a fair bit on their social asocial tendencies. So many mosquitofish school, that is, that's a species that often is found in groups. And many of them are social in the sense of, if you do an assay and you put them in an aquarium where one side of the aquarium has a little glass partition and behind that is a bunch of other mosquitofish, and the other side has a partition with no mosquitofish or maybe a few or even less sociable ones, that most of them tend to go and sit next to their other little buddies, but some of them consistently don't do that and even tend to hang out on the other side where there are no other fish. So they have repeatable differences in their sociability. And what we found, again, through a whole series of experiments that I've just got some of the references here, is that dispersal and performance are a combination of behavioral type dependent and density dependent. So at high density, social individuals do better than asocials, both in foraging and anti-predator tasks. And the asocials don't do well at high density. They are asocial and they tend to disperse more at high density. But at lower density, it's the asocials that do well and the socials that tend to disperse. And when you put those together, we had a model even early on done by Sean Fogarty here, that here's the cartoon version of that model. So here we've got beginning a mix of asocial and social individuals in a population. And if we ask who would leave, it would be the asocials because it's too crowded. And they then tend to colonize new habitat, but their very movement into new habitat actually allows socials to join in. If there were nobody colonizing to begin with, socials wouldn't even stop there. They don't like it there. But then it eventually gets too crowded and asocials again leave, move on, colonize new habitat, facilitating socials joining them. So at least in the model, the idea here is the asocials are required to facilitate the invasion of the socials, but the socials joining them keep the asocials moving on, and the overall a mix of behavioral types results in this faster, more explosive invasion. And after that, we actually talked to even sort of historians, some with the obvious thing that this is also what we think of as the American story for Caucasians or Europeans mostly, spreading across the country, where it was these sort of relatively asocial people who just don't like everybody else and move ahead, pioneers, but they're very colonizing of new habitat, at least for them, facilitated more people joining them, and then they continued to move west, I think culminating in still the asocials being up right now in places like Wyoming and Alaska. After that, we've done some experiments where we look at how the ecological impacts of residents and dispersers. This is part of the sort of invasion type story. So here we separate out who's who by just putting a bunch of mosquitofish in the top pool of an artificial stream. And several days later, some of them are still up there, and those are the residents, but some of them have dispersed all the way down to the bottom pool. And that's sort of a non-trivial decision because, you know, every pool is large enough they could just stay there. And some stay in the second, third, or fourth pool, but some made it all the way down to the bottom. And then we take the individuals from the two groups here and populate them into mesocosms, but, you know, separate mesocosms for all stay types or all dispersers, and have a standardized prey community, and then check again a month later. And what we find is here in the left panels, so basically the asocial dispersers have larger impacts on prey communities. So on the left side is the invertebrate density and diversity at the end of a month. And the key is the invaders, the dispersers that went all the way down, do drive invertebrate communities lower down than did the ones that were residents that never left. And on the right panel, it's the mean sociability score of these different populations. And the more asocial ones, which is to the left of the panel, drove invertebrate density even lower. So we think in general that behavioral type dependent dispersal can be important basically in spatial ecology. So not to get into each of these, but this is a whole series of just some of the topics in spatial ecology. And for ecologists, often they, you know, tend to ignore the fact that the animals or plants might have phenotype dependent dispersal. And we think that can be an important part of ecology whenever organisms move around. Most recently, we've also gotten into how personality and some social interactions relate to novel situations associated with human-induced rapid environmental change, including invasions. So as the world changes or as animals move around, they're often experiencing novel predators, but it might actually be novel organisms that are safe but appear dangerous. And here we're thinking of responses to us when we are actually not dangerous. For example, perhaps ecotourists. How do they respond to novel? Actually, it could be good foods. Do they, utilize new resources that come available? But how do they respond to novel bad foods, like cane toads they shouldn't eat, or for that matter, microplastics? And how do they respond to novel good or bad habitat, where the bad habitat would be ecological traps? So we've got a series of papers, some theory and some experiments, on how personality relates to their responses to that, with the goal of explaining the variation in behavioral responses that are both adaptive or maladaptive responses. And today I'm going to focus on the bad food choices, a type of evolutionary trap. So this is like the phenomena where snakes, or actually people have gotten even more interested in mammals, eating these exotic and bad for you cane toads and getting sick and even dying. Another classic example is seabirds ingesting plastic, not a good idea. And not to think that only these other animals actually are, silly enough to be eating stuff they shouldn't eat. But of course, perhaps the classic example of bad food choices is us, that we have had an evolutionary history where perhaps we have desire to have high caloric foods, so we're overeating fatty, sugary foods, and with negative consequences to our health and possibly even dying sooner than we should. So bad food choices, a common phenomenon, but not everybody does it. And so what the royal we, the lab, has been interested in recently is the social aspect of these bad food choices. And so here, how do social interactions in mosquitofish affect their responses to novel foods, either good or bad foods, and for that matter, other work on novel predators, but today I'm emphasizing the food aspect. And it's with mosquitofish, and the star of this part of the show will be Leah Pollack. Amelia Munson also did some of the work, and here they are in one of our sort of lab silly photos. So the basic and what we've really focused on, but not only on, is animals eating microplastics. So it's thought about more perhaps in marine systems, but also an issue for freshwater fish like mosquitofish. So the basic experiments that Leah and to some extent also Amelia have done is to basically give animals a chance to check out new foods that are either good or bad, but it could also be familiar foods, and videotape them and see what are the individuals doing, what are their social behaviors. In other experiments, their anti-predator behavior and their foraging behavior on these new or familiar foods that are good or bad, varying things like the group size and the group mixes. And so here's what we get. And this, again, Leah's work, that in this experiment, the good food is brine shrimp, but they've not seen it before. And the bad food are glass beads or microplastics. And what I'm showing you here is the latency to feed on the left panel, and the probability of feeding on the right panel. And the x-axis here is group size. So the main thing to see is when the groups are bigger, they are quicker. This is the average individual is quicker to begin feeding on these novel foods. And on the right panel, when they're in a bigger group, they're more likely to feed on these novel foods. And this is a good thing when it's shrimp, but it's not a good thing when it's glass or plastic. And there are differences, like they're not as likely to eat the glass. So the glass, you can see, has a longer latency to feed and they feed less on it. But in fact, particularly in bigger groups, they were quite quick to start feeding on microplastics and took quite a few bites of it. So larger groups, individuals more readily consume novel foods, good and bad. But we can also ask who in particular in the group is eating these foods. And we start here with even asking who eats more and faster with familiar food. And so here, what's being shown is the ratio or odds ratio of being first to eat or amount eaten, where the main thing to get is the ratio greater than 1 indicates higher ranked fish ate more. Higher ranked fish ate more. So what Leah did here was first watch the animals individually, but in groups, and basically get good data, a lot of it, on their dominance rank in the group. So the main thing to get here is on the familiar food, the distribution of ratios and odds ratios is clearly above 1. So higher ranked fish eat more with familiar food, and this is the standard thing. That's one of the benefits of being higher ranked. You get to eat first and eat more. But the cool thing here was this was also true. I'm sorry, that's just the summary statement on that. But it was also true with novel food, including bad novel food, which in this case included more glass beads, microplastics that were either clean or fouled with organic content, or wood chips that sort of smearing all that together. The general pattern is with novel food, it was also the higher ranked fish. So the odds ratios being greater than 1, higher ranked fish not only get to eat more, but they also tended to be first to eat and ate more of the bad novel food. So not deeply surprising, but just one of the relatively early quantitative studies on social aspect of following others into making bad decisions here about food. So Leah also did this giant experiment where she tracked the social and foraging behavior of 192 fish, individually kept track of as they were experimentally moved through different group sizes, quantifying individual differences in their behavioral plasticity and their response to changes in group size and group mixes, and how does that affect their foraging on novel, good and bad foods. And I'll leave it as analysis still in progress, because there's so much there that she, I think, keeps thinking of, well, we could also look at this and at that. And here's Leah actually celebrating with me her PhD with our giant margarita that is one of our lab traditions. Okay, so I think lots more yet to study on how social interactions within species, and we've also been interested in mixed species, that sometimes what you feed on and how you avoid novel stuff and so on depends, of course, not just on your species, but on mixes. For the little fish, it could be a mix of mosquitofish and sticklebacks. But how these overall leader-follower type things, or just social dynamics, affect use of novel good and bad foods, novel habitats, which could be human habitat, and novel dangers, predators, parasites. And most recently, we're starting work on how it might even affect responses to fire, where even though fire is so big in California, there's amazingly little work on how animals respond to approaching fire. And we're also interested in the social aspect of that. Okay, and that's sort of chapter 2. Now I'm gonna do the last 10 minutes or so on chapter 3, which is how personality and social interactions affect disease transmission or parasite transmission. And that, of course, is one of the most important topics on the entire Earth, at least for humans, over the last 20 months. And so COVID, very obviously that a major part of the whole thing is the social dynamics. And why do people do what they do in social dynamics? And this is a small opening during COVID, when they said, okay, you can interact now. That's what happens. As it turns out, we had been studying this basic issue for 10 years or so before COVID, where we were interested in how parasite loads and parasite transmission dynamics depend on social network interactions, how these depend on the movements and space use of individuals, which depends on their personality, but how the social networks also depend on the mix of behavioral types and the movements and space use of your neighbors. This is our general framework, but although it actually would be fun to study this in humans, we have instead been collecting loads of data on these guys. So these are sleepy lizards. They're fairly common in Australia. They're pretty good sized lizards. They're about 800 grams, big and chunky and slow, easy to catch and easy to put a GPS unit on to track their behavior. And amongst other things, they have ticks. They have adult ticks. They also have, loads more of larval ticks and nymphal ticks. And when I say we, this is work that I was really brought in to join Michael Bull's long-term study on the system and these topics. Mike, actually tragically passed away of a heart attack a few years ago, but we continue the study. Here's Stefan View, who is one of the early major people in the study and still works with us some on it. And I also have just a picture of my wife, Kate, holding a lizard. So all the lizards in our study site of about 1.2 kilometers square, we make a pretty good attempt to catch all the adult lizards. It tends to be about 70 in this area. And they all have a GPS unit on them, tracking every step they take for the entire active season of about 4 months, for year after year, for 9 years. Every one of them has their behavioral type assayed in standardized assays a few times a year. And because we've got all of them tracked, we know every time two individuals are relatively close together, in particular when they actually seem to sleep under a bush together. So we've got the social networks, and every couple of weeks, we pick them up again and quantify their tick loads. And the we in more recent years, since I've also had some NSF funding on it, include Ur Spiegel, who's I think gotten pretty famous on his work on this system, David Sin, and Eric Payne, who did his PhD on it. So what we find is, yes, lizards also have personalities. So this is the repeatability of their aggressiveness and boldness, sort of typical numbers here that people get, including across years. So we have multiple years of catching the same lizard. There's 2438, he's still here. And my God, he's still in more or less the same place. And of course, has a similar personality as ever. We have also repeatable differences in their space use, in their home range size, some bigger, some smaller, consistently so across years, in the size of their core home range, and also consistent differences in their home range location fidelity. So some of them tend to be in the same place year after year, but others tend to move around from year to year, and consistently different in their tendencies. And interestingly enough, we have repeatability of their tick loads with sort of different categories of the ticks. So how do these pieces fit together? So our general approach, again, framework is parasite loads might depend on social network interactions, that depend on the movements, that depend on personality. So first, it is very clear that social connectivity is related to parasite loads. So this is just, I picked a figure from one of the earlier papers that had a smaller number of animals, but what we find, not actually in all years, but as a general pattern, that higher social connectivity is associated with having more parasites. And the important part of social connectivity, the data suggests, is shared refuge use, including shared refuge use with a time lag. So this is use of the same bushes, overnight bushes to sleep under, as other lizards, even often enough that they're often using it on different days, but using the same bushes, and high overlap in general space use, where they just sort of run into each other more often. But we've got the more detailed thing on their movement ecology. We have 50 to 80 lizards per year, millions and millions of GPS data points. And this is a picture of the field site, where actually the little white, gray, and black squares are the fact that we have also mapped out the entire field site and the basically amount of food and good cover in all the locations, throughout the field site. And I have here just actually the movement tracks of 3 of the individuals that had, as it turns out, relatively large home ranges. But again, we've got the home ranges for all 70 a year, or roughly 70 a year. So what Ur then did with some of the early data is basically this summarizes the factors influencing their space use. So early in the season, when it's still cool and wet, probably the most important thing is home range center. Are they close to the home range center? They use that area a lot. And not surprisingly, the edges of the home range are used less. That's what the plus plus means. So this is just space use. Where are they now? What seems to characterize where they spend more of their time? They also, early in the season, tend to avoid areas with other lizards. Again, in a multivariate model. They do not pay much attention early in the season to where the food is more abundant or where there's better refuge, because there's food everywhere and there's no need for refuge from the hot weather yet. And there actually appears to be no significant predation risk. Late in the season, when it's dry and hot and there's less food, home range center still matters. They still somewhat avoid other lizards, but now they're spending more time where there's more food and more refuge from the heat. The shared habitat preferences that they tend to go where there's food and more refuge from heat, particularly later in the season, of course, increases their connectivity, their shared space use, but the fact that they tend to avoid conspecifics decreases their connectivity. But a key thing here is this does depend on behavioral type. And in particular, less aggressive lizards were more responsive in the sense of more attracted to the sites with more food and more attracted to sites with better refuge, particularly later in the season, than the more aggressive lizards that tend to just bluster around, somewhat oblivious to where's the food and the refuge. So the less aggressive lizards are going to have more shared use of sites, in fact, with more food and better refuge. Bold lizards tended to have larger home ranges, and that just tends to mean more overlap with other lizards. So we end up predicting that it's the bold, unaggressive lizards that will have more ticks. And as it turns out, it's the curse of having too much data, that we've got so much data on so many aspects that we've been running structured equation models, and we're still not satisfied that we've really captured how to do that with all these potential variables. So we're still working through the data, and we've got 9 years of data. But the preliminary analyses do seem to suggest that it is the bold, unaggressive lizards that have the most ticks. So this is relative tick load, aggressiveness on the x-axis for 3 different sort of groups of boldness individuals in groups. And the main thing is, again, it's the high bold, unaggressive lizards that tend to have more ticks. But we feel like we still have more analyses to do on this. So we basically have all this data with all of this. It's clear that the weather affects all of this, both directly on the lizards and on their food. Sheep actually end up getting herded in from time to time, and they affect the plants. And so we want to include that in the analyses. We did an experiment one year where we had food additions, and we can see how that affects, in specific sites, how that affected the movements and social networks and so on. And the first paper on that is, I think, almost accepted. We have been, a couple of years, we put genetically distinct tick lines on a total of 30 lizards with different behavioral types and social network positions, and then actually caught the ticks later to see how did the spread of these genetic lines of ticks go from the original lizards as a function of their behavioral type and social network. But we've just, I think, doing the genetics on the ticks that we captured off of the lizards. So that actually sort of concludes, I think, this, for us, this fun study on the sleepy lizards. And we feel like there's still lots yet to study on the overall world of animal personalities. And here I just pay final homage to my 2 original main collaborators on this work, Chad and Allison, who I gather gave a talk here not long ago. This is a picture of them from like a dozen years ago with their pets from a dozen years ago. And here's a picture of me from a dozen years ago or thereabouts with my big fish. Okay, thanks very much. That's my cramming lots of stuff together into one talk. And I'd be happy to chat more with any of you about it. Thanks much.
Thank you, Andy. Wonderful talk, really fascinating. So at this point, this is time for people to post their questions in the chat. Just a reminder for those of you who are asking questions, when you ask questions, please tell us who you are. We're trying to maintain and build this community. Tell us who you are and where you're from. And if you're on YouTube, please post your questions in the chat, and I'll be relaying those over, of course, with a little bit of a delay. So we'll get started with the questions, and the first comes from Michael Taborski.
Michael Taborski, University of Bern. Thanks very much, Andy. This was very interesting, as usual. I have a question regarding these behavioral types that you described in the mosquitofish. The so-called social and asocial behavioral types. Do you know or understand how they come about? I mean, is it early ontogeny that causes the divergence there? And could it be that there is sort of a divergence in the social niche into which they develop, and that causes the divergence? Or does it have a strong genetic signal? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, we have done, and we is Amelia Munson in particular, have done experiments recently, over the last few years, where we manipulated their early experience, whether or not she was actually focusing more on this sort of high-rec part of the lab's interests. So she manipulated their exposure to predation risk cues early on, as well as pulses of warmer water and sort of distributions of exposure to both of those. But as it turns out, she mostly focused on how it affected their later sort of boldness. And, I actually would have to look it up as to what she got on how it affected their sociability. So I'm only going to give you the answer that says we are interested in that topic. But because I didn't know you were going to ask that question, I didn't go back to look at Amelia's PhD that she just finished a few months ago. But if you're, and I know you are interested in that, actually get in touch with Amelia. She's now a postdoc up in Glasgow with Sean Killen, getting in more into physiology on it. I don't know if she's actually in the audience here. If she is, she could step in and maybe answer better. But you could get in touch with me, and I can, give you Amelia's email address.
Yeah, just a little thing I would like to add. I think this would be particularly interesting because of the potential feedback that could occur due to this effect on the social system that you find from density-dependent dispersal decisions. So I think that will be a really interesting subject for further study.
It occurs to me that for Amelia's work, it's sort of the early experience. It's one of those experiments where they had these early experimentally manipulated experiences and then actually wait. I forget if it was 1 month or even more before we assay them in various assays. But Leah's work includes tracking the individuals through a series of social, just sort of different groups. And so the notion that they might adjust their social behavioral tendencies and even their rank, but they don't have anywhere near as complex, interesting social niches, as far as I know, as animals like you study. But she probably has data on whether or not individuals' experiences recently affect, sort of winner-loser type things as they go through a series of social environments. And I think she might be in the audience right now. And if she wants to just pipe in and say, but I think that's the kind of thing where I don't think she's done the full analyses on how, but she's got the data, having tracked the animals through. So that might be a cool avenue for you to talk with Leah on how you might analyze the sort of data she's got.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Leah, if you're there and you want to pipe in with what you know about sort of social niches and feedbacks. But if not, we can.
Oh, the data's not there. We're not seeing those kinds of patterns. Not yet. I mean, maybe there's other ways to analyze it. Sorry, it's kind of an unfortunate response.
Okay, well, thank you. We can always come back to that topic if people have more questions, but I'm going to move forward in the queue here. And the next question comes from Julia Fisher.
Yes, so my name is Julia Fischer, or Julia Fischer, whatever. I'm at the University of Göttingen and at the German Primate Center. And so first of all, thank you for this really fascinating talk. I have a question. So not all of us are fortunate to have, these sample sizes that you can enjoy when you do your studies, especially with primates. Often, the sample sizes are dismal, to say the least. And I've been interested in age-related changes in behavioral tendency, boldness, motivation to engage in problem solving and stuff. And I was always wondering, how can we actually disentangle the both effects of the developmental plasticity or with age, the loss of motivation with age, versus the effects that we see in terms of the personality differences within an age group? Because I think we don't really have the power to disentangle the two. And that I suspect that many studies in our field are sort of, it's not fully deconfounded. So what's your take? Like, what do you think, what would be reasonable sample sizes actually to be able to distinguish what's the personality effect? I mean, it depends on the effect size, it's clear, that's where I'm a little bit at a loss, because I see there are huge effects with age compared to the inter-individual variation.
So, I would say that I feel like I've been willing to be excited about consistent individual differences in behavior that last for much less than a lifetime, right? If they even last for a week, they can be actually ecologically important. I mean, if they last for 10 minutes, they can be important. If you're bold and then 10 minutes later, predators show up and you're still bold, that's still a pretty big important problem. I guess when I think of it, we've got tons of data on water striders, but they're all roughly the same age. They've all, gone through an entire winter, and they're all adults the next year, and they're all roughly the same age. But whether or not later in the season, as they've all gotten older, but they're not different, they show different behaviors. They actually obviously do, but we've sort of interpreted it as it's just later in the season. And our experiments are mostly going on outdoors where it's actually getting hotter. And, so too many things are changing for us to study it. But there clearly are differences as they get older and literally are getting tired out and, and starting to physically fall apart. So it might even, and the lizards, we also have that there are mass effects, and mass is certainly related to age. We're all studying the adults. So I think it might even be that it's one of these differences where, to begin with, I guess I'm saying that I'm interested in the topic, but apparently not interested enough to focus on it, even though I probably have enough data to say some things about it. I think we're about to do the next wave of analyses on the lizard data. And I think, I can't remember, I don't know who in my lab is actually listening, but we'll try to pay more attention to whether or not the mass differences actually have something to do with age, or have an interesting age effect. The lizards can live 30, 40, 50 years. So even our 9 years is a bit of a drop in the bucket for these really long lived things.
So we're doing, or we're trying to set up something similar in Barbary macaques, where we also have both longitudinal and cross-sectional data, and then see whether we find consistent differences when the animals are 10 are the ones that are super bold. When they're 10, they're also still bolder than everybody else, to see what is consistent, even though the overall level drops. But so thank you very much for, I'll keep you posted. We're just beginning with the analysis. So
or do you know of any studies besides human studies that go for long enough to really address the issue?
Not in among.
I feel like primates, it feels conceivable. I mean, with the lizards, we even could publish data basically saying one of the messages is it's pretty unusual that we have repeated assays of the same individuals over even 3, 4, 5 years. That's not a common thing in this field. But Yeah. No, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Thanks.
Okay, so our next question comes from Adriana.
Hi, Adriana Maldonado Chaparro from Universidad de Rosario in Colombia. Thank you, Andy, for such a great talk. My question is more about curiosity. At the beginning with the water strider studies, you mentioned that the hyper-aggressive males, they didn't get more mating than the normal ones, right? Did they get less matings? Okay, if that's the case, were they more coercive with females to access matings, or did they change any other behavior for getting some mating and copulation?
Yeah, so I'll take that your question at the deeper level is, why do they do that? Why do they exist? And I'll say, I don't know for sure, but they get less mating. In our standard situations, which I think experimental setups that tend to have a somewhat higher density than nature, but not crazily higher density. In fact, sort of just the upper end of densities we see in nature is most of our experiments. They don't appear to be even better at overcoming female resistance. And they basically have even fewer encounters with females per unit time than other males, even in the same pool, much less in general. But an aspect that I didn't end up talking about today is we have a series of experiments finding that there are alternative mating systems in water striders. So I described the entire mating system in typical mid to large size pools, which are not that big in nature, but in little eddies, which exist dotted around in streams that are often like the size of your tabletop or smaller. You can get where a single male can actually dominate the system and successfully get matings. And so we haven't done the work yet, but we think that's at least one case where the hyper-aggressive male is the ones that dominate these small pools, or at least can do that and actually get to mate and be successful. But the hyper-aggressive ones are, quote unquote, the ones that don't seem to realize I am now in a pool that's too big to do that. And in a bigger pool, I just can't actually dominate the entire pool, and I've ended up just messing up everything for everybody, including myself. So what we've got right now is when you study them in smaller pools, sometimes you get the same quote unquote usual water strider mating system, but fairly often you do get one dominant male taking over the entire pool and actually getting more matings than others. And we've been really interested in when do you get one system or the other, because for small pools, it means in the lab, we can set up 80 of them. And within a day or two, 42 of them have turned into normal mating systems, and 18 of them have turned into a hyper-aggressive male dominated one, and 12 of them have even this other system that we've never seen before, and so on.
That's so cool. A quick follow-up question. Is there any particular trait related to hyper-aggressive? So are these males smaller than the other males, or there's nothing?
We actually have not found a morphological trait that seems to explain who's hyper-aggressive. Yeah, and we haven't actually looked back. And I guess this is sort of amazing, and I think it probably relates to my tendency to just get excited about something else and start studying something else, even with the data we've got. But we've actually still never gone back to really carefully look at what were those hyper-aggressive males doing in like the 5 days before he went hyper-aggressive. Was there something interesting about his life relative to others? And we actually have those data over and over, and we've just never gone back and done that. But now that you've got me thinking about that, I have a new student who's interested in whether or not he can get a publication out of just looking at all of our old data. And I will suggest that to him.
Thank you very much, Andy.
Right, I'm going to write that down. Okay, but I can.
Okay, well, Annie's taking some notes. please keep posting your questions in the chat and I'll forward them to him. I actually have two from YouTube. So I'm going to look over at the screen over here. Both questions come from Aman Perkis at the University of Pennsylvania. The first
about
question,
to come to Davis, actually. Yeah.
So his first question is, do you know anything about the socially dependent mechanisms of water striders becoming hyper-aggressive? And that might have been something you were just talking about, but.
Yeah, so amazingly enough, in the main pools, the main studies, we have not actually looked at that, despite the importance of the hyper-aggressive males. We've ended up just sort of delving into the data in all sorts of other ways, but yeah, that is something we need to go back and just look at. Yeah, I would say that there wasn't anything obviously different about the pools, the overall social makeup of the pool before he goes hyper-aggressive, but I'm definitely interested in looking harder at what he was doing the days before that. I'd like to quickly note, since I still see Michael Taborski's face here on my screen, that I think part of the issue with like Leah's data is when you have videotapes, as you probably know, there's a bazillion things you can get off of the videotapes. But when we know what we're looking for, we have a question, we get the things we have in question. But when later we realize it would be nice to know that, the sort of time and patience to go back to the videotapes and look at them again is sort of excruciating. So not to put this on Leah, but it wouldn't surprise me if there's more to what's actually, I think we're sure we know there's more in there than we've extracted so far. And it's the classic thing that maybe many of you know is there's endless stuff in the videos, but it's a lot of time and work to pull it out of the videos as to, who was doing what on one day that might affect their social behavior in the next days. And, we've got a similar thing with the water striders, though not quite as much data.
Okay, so I'm going to, Aman had a second question, which was, is hyperaggression a truly distinct group? Or do you think it's more along a spectrum that they're like in the top 10% or something?
Yeah, we see the behavior itself as being truly distinct in that there are other males that are fairly aggressive in the sense that they are, running around and are more active about dashing across and jumping on animals and trying to mate with them. But the hyper-aggressive ones are the ones that actually, so what most males do, and I should have said this during the talk, what males do all day long is they jump on other individuals, including males, but when they jump on a male, they jump right off. And so they spend a lot of the day jumping on other males, realizing immediately that's a male and jump right off. But when they jump on a female, they do seem to typically realize right away it's a female and struggle and try to mate. And the hyper-aggressive males are distinctly the ones that jump on males, and for that matter, on other stuff, and clearly are trying to position themselves to mate. And the other males are just not doing that. So there is this clear thing. And the ones that are doing that, some of them only do it like once. And we think, oh, starting to look hyper-aggressive. But the ones that we classify as hyper-aggressive are doing that, repeatedly with everybody they jump on. And then it's also obvious they're typically super geared up, that the slightest movement across on the other side of the pool, they seem amazingly aware and dash over there at sort of as fast as a water strider can go and jump on it and furiously try to mate with it. And even other aggressive males that we call aggressive but not hyper-aggressive aren't quite that geared up. But the main thing is they are obviously super trying to mate with males and with other stuff. And some of them do that just continually for some period of time. And the others, almost everybody else is just not doing that. I will say that there are papers, well, no, I won't get into that. So onwards.
Okay. Next question is from Taylor Evans.
Hi, I'm Taylor. I'm finishing up a PhD at Georgetown, the Shark Bay Dolphin Project. And so I was thinking about the way how your switch between the shorter-lived water striders over to what you might see in the longer-lived lizards. So our study system is obviously also extremely long-lived. And we do seem to see at least social traits lasting their entire lifetime. We just kind of recently published. I wonder if you would see a difference between, something you said that not all personality traits have to be lifetime stable. So I was wondering, like, if you would treat something like, this hyperactive male syndrome that maybe they switch out of after a certain amount of time, like if you'd expect to see differences in traits and like how you would treat behavioral traits in a longer lived species. It's kind of like how that framework interacts. I'd be super interested in your opinions.
Yeah. Well, I don't know what other systems have got on the issue of hyperaggressive males. I feel like I've heard anecdotes over the years of people talking about their what could be called hyperaggressive males in a sexual selection or sort of mating system context. So I've been told stories of frogs that will mate with anything, that are furiously trying to mate with, and that one of the assays of frog, that at least I can't remember who did this, frog, sort of mating drive is even just giving them I think it was like just a little bag that is roughly the size and shape of a female. And some of the males are really geared up to mate with that and won't get off of it and so on, and heard stories about maybe it was a geese, I think, who, the male is just totally out of control. But I actually don't know who else is focused in on. And so every time I hear that anecdote, I tell the person, whoa, you should get data on that, on how much are they doing it and how does that affect, and the same kind of thing we do with water striders. But I actually don't know who else has gone ahead and done that. But my sense is it does exist in at least some number of other systems. Whether or not another part of your question, I think, was about just sort of long-term stability of personalities, and the hyper-aggressive goes on and off, but males that are hyper-aggressive are more likely than others to go hyper-aggressive again later. But they just, I think, can't literally physically keep it up for a long time. But the general activity aggressive type of the water strider males is also reasonably stable over time. They just have a much overall shorter time scale to their lives, or to their adult mating system lives. So I might not know exactly which aspect you were interested in.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, it's just traits that can switch on and off. Compared to ones that seem to be stable over a lifetime, like whether you would treat those, or maybe they influence each other. Like if hyperactive males who seem to switch back onto that maybe have a certain type, or if you see that kind of stuff in shorter lived species that maybe are more prone to seasonal variation because they don't experience season after season or year after year. Maybe it's less likely. Right. And like, I don't know, I'd be super interested what you see with the lizards when you kind of do a comparison.
Yeah, I think whether you call it social plasticity or just sort of condition dependent or sort of energy reserves dependent plasticity, I guess the hyper aggressive males, but we really haven't tracked this, as to really knowing that they're run out of energy. But I guess they are more plastic than others in being the extreme hyper aggressive. But I would say that, we should just go back and quantify that more carefully. But my impression is then, after a couple of days of that, they get exhausted, and then they probably go to being really among the more inactive for some time. But I'd have to go back and look. So I'm going to write that down also.
Super interesting. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thanks for your question.
Okay, so our next question comes from Donald Kramer.
Oh.
Hi, Andy.
Hey. Right, good to see you. Yeah.
Nice to see you. Great talk. So for others, I'm Don Kramer, retired behavioral ecologist from McGill University, not doing active research at the moment, but still working with a couple of past students and getting some previous work published. So Andy, I loved the talk. It was really great to see so much interesting work and a lot touching on fields of dispersal and habitat use and so on that are dear to my heart. But I'm wondering, you talked about a lot of different traits, different axes, exploratory or dispersal tendencies, aggressiveness, boldness, and so on. And I'm just wondering, what's the view now on how well those traits are correlated or not? I mean, do we have a clear sense of how many personality or syndrome axes there are and how consistent that is among species? Or is that still kind of an open question?
Okay, yeah, good question. I would probably put it as others have done, meta-analyses basically of, how consistent are these patterns? How strong are behavioral syndromes? How often do you see correlations between bold and aggressive, and when do you see them or not? I have not done that myself. I would say it certainly varies a lot, that sometimes you see correlations and not uncommonly you don't. Exactly how people have measured boldness or aggressiveness seems to matter on whether or not. And so I would say that it's not surprising to me that that there's variation in the phenomenon. And so, it's almost like the last summary I've seen of that might even be Laszlo Garamitsegi doing it like 10 years ago or 8 years ago or something. Maybe some of you know of a more recent review, but I think I left it as, yes, obviously sometimes we see it and sometimes we don't. And then exactly how many types of behavioral types there are is one of these, I would call it almost a semantic issue, that when people use the word boldness, it actually ends up meaning various different things as far as what the actual assay was. Quite often boldness is measured by looking at sort of latency to emerge from a little refuge in a standard assay situation that is new to them, which could be just as easily called space neophobia, right? Willingness to go out into some open new place they've never been before. And I guess that's boldness, but you could give it a different name, and so on. That it'd be hard to pin down how many different types of personality axes there are in the animal world, because for different animals, it even makes sense to look at different things. I will quickly, just to maybe even sell you on the fact that my latest interest that I'm going to talk to my lab on reviewing the literature on this afternoon is on what we've been calling fear generalization, that we're really quite excited about, but we have no idea how common it's going to be because there's little study of it. But although there's been quite a few studies of boldness, fear, consistency for things about obvious danger relative to predators, we're interested in whether or not fear of predators is correlated to fear of other things that are not predators but are potentially dangerous. And that we think there's relatively little data on, is your fear of predators correlated to your fear of disease risk? Is it basically fearful people in general who are fearful of dangers out in the streets are fearful of COVID? Are they also afraid for animals, let's say, of novel things about food? Are they afraid of chemical stressors? Are they more sensitive to chemical stressors that could be dangerous because they're just generally sensitive to danger? And what we're really interested in is, are they fearful of fire? Because we're feeling like most animals here in California, as much as California has fires, have actually never seen fire. And for many of them, their population has not even seen fire, even if they're in a fire-prone region. Fires actually don't occur in any given spot very often. So we're excited to see, are individuals that are afraid of predators more likely to be afraid of fire that they've never seen before? Is there a generalization of a general fear across sort of situations, danger contexts that are very different? And as far as we know, there's almost no data on that. So I guess wasn't that close to Don's question, but I just, that's something we've gotten really excited about just this last couple of months. Anybody have opinions on that?
interesting directions. Yes, I was thinking that the correlations among the traits may relate to the mechanisms underlying them, as some of the domestication literature has recently shown, and that would influence how selection acts on one trait and might bring along other traits that might be less adaptive, but still with trade-offs might be overall adaptive. So thanks for that update. It's interesting to know just how much work still there is to be, how many things there are still to be discovered. And thanks again for your talk.
Yeah, so I think there are conceivable and likely mechanisms that could explain why boldness and aggressiveness are correlated. But what I think we've got enough here at this point is that boldness and aggressiveness sometimes are not correlated, and that for a more mechanistic person, I think won't be a surprise that the mechanisms often have enough complexity and plasticity that even though you could find a mechanism for why when they are correlated, you can, by digging deeper, understand why in other situations they're not correlated. And I think that would be totally cool to actually, the examples that can understand even mechanistically, when are they correlated, when are they not correlated. Actually, I'd be fascinated to hear anybody's impressions on whether or not they think fear of fire is going to be related to fear of predators. Or for that matter, is fear of predators going to be related to sensitivity about places where they can detect there's a chemical stressor? Are those going to be correlated? I mean, I think there's almost no data on it, but are they going to be correlated or not? And if you have a guess, why do you think they might be correlated or not? Like, they're totally different. So a smart animal would have no connection between those two. But on the other hand, go ahead, yeah.
I think in some species we know that even different potential species, you offer them as, well, you may be dangerous or not, they make a quite clear distinction between predators and non-predatory species. So I don't see why it should be, if there's already no correlation, when some have a general fear, but others, we had also animals that could distinguish a snail from a predator or a herbivore from a predator.
Yeah.
From birth, innate, innate. So they had no previous experience. I was really surprised. So they knew it. So if they would not be afraid of fire, they would only be afraid of the predator. But it is obviously a species-specific thing, because in our social fish, they were afraid of everything. There you may have a chance, Yeah,
and I think you know, that would be our starting point. Also, I think we're going to review the literature, or probably review whether or not someone else has already recently reviewed the literature on what do we know about the patterns of, if you are afraid of this predator, are you also afraid of that predator, in particular a novel predator that you've never seen before. And we know there are cases of where animals can distinguish how dangerous are different predators.
Tons of papers from this Ferrari and Chivas brown Ferrari. They have
absolutely
tried out all combinations of species.
Yeah, that's right. So that's the way we even refer to it as. So we know Maud Ferrari has done, and her group has done a bunch on this, and we're going to see who else has done it. But we still feel like it's pretty conceivable that if you're a fearful animal, then you're more likely, and therefore would be afraid of predators even more than your buddies are afraid of predators, that when some weird thing that's fire, that's smoke, that you'll be more afraid of smoke than others. And we might even work on this with Dan, who's in the audience there. That it's almost sort of like Dan is going to study aspects of this. He's geared up to do it. And maybe we'll get a chance to join him and Bree Putnam in doing that. But we've got plans to do it with some of our own animals up here. And we're excited about it. Or, you know, I'll note that we're excited about this thing. There's almost no work on how animals respond to fire. Like, there's almost no work on how animals respond to smoke. Literally to the point where, like, this one paper that's getting cited by others thinking about this, you know, I just love this example. It was actually basically in a zoo-like setup, where the caretaker burned his pastry, and thus there was smoke in the room, and then noticed that the sleepy lizards seemed to be kind of excited about this and were trying to like get out of their tank. And that ends up being a published paper that is one of the super rare examples of just doing the study on how animals respond to smoke. Just a topic we're excited about.
Maybe it's not my turn, but I only put my question mark in for that topic. I don't understand why animals should be scared of fire. Where I grew up in Middle Europe, where I work in the Saghalien Karoo, there are no natural fires. There's no reason why animals should have evolved fear of fire more than fear of, let's say, a scissor. So I think it would be maybe important to compare between species where natural fires do occur and where they do not occur.
Yeah. And so, you know, there is a sense that, like in the predator literature, animals that have had a long exposure to fire in their evolutionary history, perhaps in their personal history, that they should sort of realize that when a fire is getting pretty close, or even maybe when it's still pretty far away, you better do something about it. And if the fire, you know, comes really close, we're figuring that even fire naive animals at some point will realize, oh my God, this is weird, but it's getting really hot, and there's this choking smoke, and there's, you know, all this stuff, and that I think, you know, animals are going to go hide, but we wouldn't be surprised if they do something similar to what they do relative to predators or other dangers. Like if their tendency is to go hide under something, they're going to go hide under something. And if their tendency is to climb a tree, they're going to climb a tree. And if they can fly, they're going to fly away. But there seems to be anecdotes, but not much information on it. So I still feel like when fire's coming, you know, if it's off in the distance and it typically doesn't actually spread much, then, you know, maybe they won't respond.
I think I have a question up there before Taborski.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead,
Thanks.
Claire.
That's okay. I'm Clara B. Jones, Mammals.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for the talk. Very interesting. Whenever I read a paper on behavioral syndromes, I'm always interested in possible evolutionary effects.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in one of your first slides, you did print evolution.
Mm-hmm.
My question is, if we can agree that evolution would be a change in gene frequencies across generations, and if we can agree that that is a population level effect, how do you know that selection is acting on the variability that you are speaking of and not some other direct effect that it is a correlate of, or not some other trait that it is a correlate of, such as, for example, a primary trait might be body size?
Yeah, I think we, you know, one of the early just sort of notions of why study behavioral syndromes was even almost a critique of how behavioral ecologists often studied one specific trait or type of behavior in one context, like you're studying mating behavior. And so we were even emphasizing that the individual's mating behavior quite likely is correlated as part of an overall behavioral syndrome to their foraging behavior outside of the mating season, or their anti-predator behavior outside of the mating season or in the mating season. You know, just that behavior is a whole package that has correlated elements, and that selection on your behavior relative to mating season might depend on how it's correlated to behavior in all these other contexts. And that I think even I think of it as the pace of life syndrome idea, is that of course is still a package of behaviors that's correlated to aspects of their life history, their morphology, their physiology, their immune function, and others on to their overall cognitive. So I think it is part of my thinking and thinking of others, that it's all a big package, but not an unbreakable package, not an unshapable package, but that selection is on the overall integrated phenotype, if you wish, and that to really fully understand evolution of any given aspect of the animal personality, it's part of a behavioral syndrome that is part of a bigger package of the phenotype. And I think that's a reasonable statement. Actually studying everything, it's already became a bit of a pain to study several different behaviors in different contexts, but studying all of it is. But go ahead.
Yeah, let me push that just one step further. If we can agree that evolution will affect traits correlated, as you say, or individual traits that are genetically correlated, that is a necessary condition in order for evolution to occur. Do you know that the traits that you are talking about are genetically correlated?
I would say that my lab has not tended to focus on or do the quantitative genetics to have good data on that. I'd have to think which system has what data, but we have, for example, with the water striders, kept track of SIB ships. So if you're a quantitative geneticist, this is medium weak data because it's all full SIB or unknown, since females store sperm at all, whether it's full SIB or half SIB or what mix, but the eggs from this female versus that female. So we have kept track of that. And there is a not very strong statistical signal that later during the mating season, when we know who came from which SIB ship, that there is some evidence of heritability of their activity aggressiveness. And I'm just thinking, which of the other systems do we have the data on? But I'd go with it when people look at it and are quantitative geneticists. I think in the large majority of cases, there are genetic correlations also between these traits. It's not like we've got the data on all of them, but heritability is almost always, significant if you've got a pretty big sample size. It's like for almost everything you can measure in humans, the heritability is between 0.2 and 0.5. But I think we don't know it in any good solid quantitative genetic sense, because that's more work than we've been willing to put in to do that on top of the things we are doing that is more ecological.
Thanks for your work.
Yeah, thanks for your question.
So I think the next would be Barbara. Did you have another question?
Yes, yeah, I had a question.
Go ahead, please.
Hi, Andy. Great talk. So I'm Barbara Taborski from University of Bern. And I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned social plasticity several times and social skill, which is, as you know, we call it social competence, which is an adaptive form of social flexibility or plasticity. And you talk about behavioral types, right? So maybe it's a semantic question, but I wanted to ask you about your relationship between the two. So we know from your water striders, but also from our fish, that some fish are able to show towards a gradient of a certain stimulus, they show a more appropriate response. So they have a steeper response to that behavior. And we have other individuals that have an entirely flat reaction norm, if you wish. Whatever you show them, they just do their thing. Yeah. So I wonder whether you would go so far to say that it's a consistent difference in plasticity, adaptive plasticity. So I wonder if you would go so far to say they have a plastic behavioral type, which for me is a contradiction somehow.
Yeah. So on the final part of your question, I will note that as it happens, when I give a talk that is more on the social skills stuff, of course, your work that precedes our work on social competence ends up getting highlighted even with some examples and stuff like that. But here I crammed everything in there. And but yeah, I think it's just an important topic in general. I think I end up thinking of it as could be called just semantics on whether or not individual differences in their skill, plasticity, competence, which are quite different, is an aspect of personality or not. I mean, I feel like you could say semantically that that's part of a personality, even though personality is defined as consistent individual differences as if it was one behavior. I think consistent individual differences in behavioral flexibility, and of course, behavioral skill and behavioral flexibility are not the same. You can be highly plastic and stupid about it, right?
Yes, sure, but I'm talking about this more adaptive form of plasticity, where you do the right thing in the right situation, but you're more able to do that, and that is a form of you can adjust your behavior better. So it's a form of flexibility. And I mean, I have a problem to say, well, they have a flexible behavior type because most people would kill you for it. Yeah. But it is a consistent ability of these animals, right?
So you are willing to call that a personality trait, that they are flexible?
I would probably not do it, but I wanted to ask whether you would do it.
Yeah, no, I've actually not only am willing to do it, I have been doing it. And as a small story, I tried to do it in a paper like 10 years ago. And actually it was Dave Westney told me, that's just wrong. You can't do that. And I think he forced me to take it out of the paper to get it accepted. And so this is an ongoing debate.
Yeah,
are we willing to call individual differences in plasticity a personality trait? I feel like it's part of the proactive reactive idea that we have been willing to call that a individual differences, sort of personality, but call it coping style for that, trait. And so I feel like there's even a historical reason why we can do what apparently you and I are happy to do, is call that a personality trait. I actually didn't go back to look at the human literature to see what they say about that, but
that might be interesting, yeah, because lots of what we do about the social competence is also inspired by the human or social skill, so it's inspired by human literature. Yeah, okay. I just wanted to hear
no,
what you said. Okay. Thank you.
Right.
So at this point there's no more questions in the queue, Andy, but there are a couple more comments going back to fire in the chat.
Yeah.
So I thought maybe we could wrap up the discussion with just addressing some of these. And then, because you have a busy afternoon scheduled. So we'll just quickly go through these, and I think that will be the end of the fine today. So Miles Machinsky, a graduate student at UTC, wrote, "Thanks for the talk and discussion. Backtracking a bit, I think even species that don't have personal evolutionary familiarity with fire may still exhibit fear or uncertainty if exposed." And he wrote some examples below. He also wrote about it's a little different than a hidden threat like a heated stove, or an individual human may not realize it poses a threat until it's touched or they're burned. So do you have any comments to follow up that? Because I know it's going along the lines of where you're interested in the fear of fire.
Yeah. So that is exactly the topic that we've got a paper that should be within a week or two of being submitted. It's invited by Ecology Letters, but I have no idea if they'll like it. But it is that that we feel that even animals that are naive to fire, certainly at a personal level, but even possibly at more or less an evolutionary level, that it's so rare, even in their, as fires become more prevalent in new places and so on, that, as I think, was it Mike noted later, that fire has these sounds, and it has smoke, and it's got weird heat and light, and that that we in fact make a series of predictions based somewhat on neophobia, somewhat on fear generalization, sort of uncertainty, generalization that are quite parallel to the ideas you've got here, but we did our best to sort of weave out from theoretical and empirical literature on how do prey respond to predator cues that they are not familiar with, but might suggest, and relate to neophobia and uncertainty and fear generalization, that they'll respond to fire in those ways. But at this point, there's very little actual data on it. Let me think, like I can,
I have an observation. One of the things that I think of with fire is that there is a thermal gradient.
Absolutely.
So individuals might vary with respect to the range of thermal, of heat that they are active within, or that they display an avoidance response to.
Yeah, I think the way we're thinking about it is that fires have a set of cues, and they will arrive to the animal in different time points along the whole thing. And it'll even depend on things about the weather, but they might get smoke. They might see that light has got something weird going on there. They might hear crackling sounds that are not part of their normal world, that could be quite loud. And eventually it might even get pretty hot. And that, there's going to be a world of sensory ecology that for many of them, these are still going to be new things. But in other cases, like a heat gradient, it might be a weirdly new heat gradient. But I'm basically agreeing with you that when it starts to get pretty hot, there will be differences among species in their sensitivity to things are getting hot at an odd rate. There actually is information on smoke, that smoke has chemical properties that appear to be similar to chemicals that are associated with some predators that actually might, apparently are the same chemicals are known to actually even have receptors that I think it was rats and some lizards, like it's evolutionarily conserved. That's the level at which we could take guesses. Like these might actually be that smoke might, amazingly enough, have some overlap with predator cues. But how all this works.
I think there's a huge literature on thermal sensitivity in lab studies, especially.
Yeah. So we're guessing that but I don't even know if there's, anyway, I think that'll be also a fruitful part of the overall sort of sensory ecology. But you're right, that probably has better information than even stuff like what do animals think about loud sounds.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, I think there's a ton of cool stuff to do.
And I think Donald's comment here regarding savanna habitats sort of gets at maybe even a downstream effect. If there's fire and prey are moving around, they're more vulnerable, and predators may cue in on that. So may actually be attracted to fire.
Yeah, and so that's in papers that do exist on fire behavior. That's pretty cool, and that there are also beetles that are attracted to go to the fire because after that, that's their good oviposition sites in the post fire period. And we have been also just thinking about the somewhat better study, so fire is like loads more on plants and plant fire ecology, and some amount on, if you come back like months later, which animals have showed up in the post-fire zone and what are they doing. But even less on that than I think would be ideal. That would be, lots of still low-hanging fruit on that. But what we found is even less is on how do they respond to approaching fire to begin with. But I can't tell if this is going to take off as one of the new topics in my lab, but seems to be moderate interest. And if we get going on it, we'll, I think, likely collaborate with Dan, who I don't know if he's still out there, but excited to possibly work with him some, both up in Davis and in Southern California, because fire is all everywhere. So we did just have yesterday the biggest rainfall, apparently, like in Northern California in history or something to that effect. Like it just rained an amazing amount. So who knows what's going to happen next.
I don't remember the exact nature of the story, and maybe Karsten can jump in here. The Florida scrub jays, and their social systems are dramatically impacted by fire, predictable fire, I think, in the southeast.
Yeah. Right.
Might be a system to look into.
Yeah, no, so that again seems like kind of low-hanging fruit is after the fire, and it's going to depend on the spatial extent of the fire and how strong and intensive a fire it was, but clearly it's a major habitat disturbance, and it does appear that a lot of animals that have good mobility ran away from it and come right back and to their old home, but everything is different now, and at the individual and social level, how do they adjust to that? Actually seems like a really cool topic. And, we've got one of the students here wants to do that with some birds. And yeah.
So how will the student experimentally manipulate the fire when you say it's so important, the smoke and the noise? It is difficult to standardize this.
Yeah. So, what we're thinking, of course, you may be thinking of larger, more mobile animals, and we would not know quite how to do that experiment with birds, but we're thinking more of the simple thing of, inspired perhaps by the lizards and the burned pastry, that we're probably not going to burn a bunch of pastry, not going to waste a bunch of pastry, but we're thinking of actually something like using one of these bee smokers and just pumping smoke into an arena that we built and looking at what beetles do, or crickets, or perhaps small lizards, just small enough animals. And that ought to be a pretty easy experiment to run, and probably could build a field version and even take it out and put it on top of an ant colony, or at least part of the ant colony, and so on. So the smoke part actually seems reasonably straightforward. Getting, tapes of the sound of fire burning also doesn't seem too tough to do. And we've made contacts with the community here that does prescribed fires, where they do burns to remove the lower vegetation to reduce the spread of big fires, that should allow us to actually physically be there when they do a controlled fire. And we'll see what the animals do, before and after. So stuff like that. And then big fires are going constantly, but we probably won't be allowed to go there and actually be right there in a big real fire. Though one of the students actually has, some sort of red badge or whatever it's called that says she can actually have something to do with real fires. I don't think we'll actually do that. I didn't want to actually focus the whole thing on fire, but it is cool, I think.
I see here, Miles.
The social aspect, I think, is largely unstudied as to whether or not, once your somebody gets like, oh my God, I'm getting out of here. How much does that actually induce loads of others in the face of something weird is happening to just get out of there?
Yeah, I see it. Miles has a question mark in here. I suspect it's related to this.
Oh, Miles, yeah.
Hi, yeah. I'm Miles Machinsky, a grad student in Lauren's lab at UTC. So I actually have to go, so I hopefully will be able to summarize all that we're talking about here, because I know that you're getting to kind of an end on the fire subject as well. But one of the things that I was thinking of when writing the little bit that I did in the chat, it connected to something you were saying in some of your ideas of being able to test individuals' responses to these different factors of fire, so like smoke, heat, sound. I would be interested after separately testing those if there's any possible way to do combinations of that, especially if looking in species where they don't have this evolutionary adaptation or familiarity with fire. I think that to some degree, all those novel stimuli separately may not have an effect, but together, the amount of novel stimuli can kind of reach this threshold of uncertainty or too much stress. And then that would prompt a flee or some sort of response from the individual. And you can even get into combining some of your work on focusing on personality differences. I think that that could also present some opportunities to look at personality differences of when these thresholds are met of even though these novel stimuli may not seem threatening separately, individuals are like, okay, now is the time where I got to get out of here, or I have to make some sort of response. But overall, great talk, really interesting stuff. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for that comment. That is definitely on our radar of how important are multiple cues. It does turn out that it's, of course, a lot more work to actually start presenting multiple cues in all the various combinations, but that's on the radar.
Well, I think at this point, it's just about 1 o'clock in the Eastern time zone. And Andy, if it's okay, I think we'll wrap it up for today. And then, because I know you have some meetings with folks, we do have a sort of informal session. People may, if you want to hang around a little bit longer, just to chat.